The night the McAllister plantation grew silent, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. The candles flickered in the grand hall as Master Thaddeus McAllister leaned back in his chair, a cruel smirk cutting across his weathered face. Across the room, Mariah knelt on the cold floor, her hands bound, her eyes wide and unyielding. He had called her forward that evening, insisting on discipline for some imagined slight. But the truth was far darker. Mariah had resisted him too many times, her spirit refusing the chains of his ownership. He had long believed that enslaved people were nothing more than property, their defiance a threat to his authority. And tonight, he intended to teach her a lesson that would resonate through the quarters. With a glint of steel in his hand, he advanced. Mariah's throat quivered, but her eyes, fiery, resolute, refused to waver. She did not beg, she did not plead. Instead, she simply stared, and in that gaze was the promise of a reckoning he could not yet foresee. "Do you know what it means to disrespect me, girl?" he hissed, voice low but dripping venom. "Do you know the price of insolence?" Mariah said nothing, as he had already taken her tongue from her, a cold, precise cut that silenced her voice, leaving only a ragged scar and a gasp of pain. For a moment, McAllister laughed, a harsh, brittle sound echoing off the walls. His amusement filled the room, but outside, beyond the flickering candlelight, the world seemed to pulse with quiet anticipation, as though the very night had been waiting for something he could not yet understand. He turned away, satisfied that he had asserted his dominion. The house settled into an uneasy quiet, and Mariah, though rendered speechless, clenched her fists and met the darkness with a defiance that burned hotter than any fire he could ignite. Dawn had not yet broken when something unexpected began to stir in the McAllister barn. Outside, the mists of early morning coiled around the corral, moving like silent phantoms over the hay. The farmhands, still groggy from the previous night, sensed something different in the air, an unease they could not name. Mariah had been moved to the barn under the cover of darkness, left tied to a post while McAllister strode through the plantation, confident in his victory. But in the quiet shadows, her mind worked faster than pain or fear could restrain it. Though she had lost her tongue, her body and will remained intact. Her eyes darted to the scattered tools, the chains, the spikes still embedded in the wood from past punishments. She began to plot, silent as the night itself. Hours passed. The barn remained deserted. McAllister, certain his power was absolute, retreated to his quarters to drink and gloat, unaware that his authority was slipping like sand through his fingers. The sun's first rays began to break the horizon, spilling faint light across the fields. A soft wind whispered through the barn's cracks, and Mariah, using nothing but her hands and sheer determination, manipulated the ropes with careful precision. Her fingers, calloused from labor and hardened by suffering, freed her from the post. Step by step, she moved toward the far corner of the barn, where a stout wooden board and a row of iron spikes rested. McAllister had not considered that she might use these tools against him. With painstaking care, she gathered what she needed. By the time the master emerged, expecting to see a broken girl, he would instead encounter a force of vengeance he could not comprehend. When the hour was right, Mariah positioned the spikes along the barn door, staining them lightly with mud and the remnants of the night's hay, concealing their deadly sharpness. Then she waited. The morning grew louder as McAllister's steps echoed across the yard, and with each footfall, the inevitability of his fate drew nearer. The first scream pierced the air hours later, his own. McAllister had entered the barn, arrogantly certain of his control. Mariah, unarmed in the conventional sense but equipped with centuries of resilience and cunning, sprang her trap. The spikes, hidden until the last moment, captured him in the mouth, leaving him pinned in a grotesque tableau of his own cruelty. Blood ran freely, the metallic scent mixing with the earthy aroma of hay and sweat. The farmhands arrived moments later, finding the master in the barn, bound by the same instruments he had once used to torment others. The sight was both horrifying and mesmerizing. The man who had laughed while removing her tongue now faced the silence of his own defeat, his power rendered meaningless before the raw force of Mariah's ingenuity. By the time the sun reached its zenith, the McAllister plantation had learned a grim truth. Cruelty is not absolute, and vengeance, when meticulously planned, can transcend voice, strength, and expectation. Mariah stood outside the barn, bloodied hands gripping the ropes of her oppressor's punishment, eyes dark with unspoken triumph. Though she could not speak, the world understood her story. The legend of Mariah spread quietly at first, whispered among the fields, carried in fear and awe from one quarter to another. Slaves who had labored under the lash, overseers who had watched cruelty with apathy, and even other masters took note. This woman, silenced in body but never in spirit, had rewritten the rules of power in a single, calculated act. The barn, once a symbol of terror, had become her canvas of retribution, and for Mariah, the silence of her tongue had become the instrument of the loudest statement the McAllister plantation would ever know. The plantation had risen with the sun, but nothing about the morning felt normal. The roosters crowed, yet their calls were sharp and uneasy. The dogs barked, then fell strangely quiet. Even the horses, usually restless at dawn, paced their stalls as if sensing a storm that had not yet touched the sky. The first person to see the barn door was Elijah, a young stable boy who had long learned to keep his eyes lowered and his mouth shut. He walked toward the barn with a pail in his hands, humming a tune under his breath, but the melody died when he saw the thick smear of dark red trickling down the wooden planks. At first, he thought it was old rust, maybe spilled from a tool, but then he saw the shape behind it, the boots, the legs, the slumped shadow caught at a grotesque angle. Elijah dropped the pail. The clang echoed through the yard. Within minutes, overseers and house servants rushed from every corner of the plantation. Men whispered prayers under their breath, women clutched their aprons, and children hid behind their mothers' skirts. They all knew something monumental had happened, something dangerous, something that could unmake the world they lived in. It was Overseer Brill who finally crossed the threshold. He reached up, grabbed the barn door, and yanked it wide open. What he saw made him stumble back. Master Thaddeus McAllister hung half-seated, half-slumped against the door, his body twitching in weak spasms. The iron spike pinned through his tongue glistened with fresh blood. His eyes, usually filled with icy confidence, now bulged in terror, darting around as if begging someone, anyone, to help him. "Sweet Lord Almighty," Brill whispered, his voice trembling. But no one rushed forward. No one touched him. Not yet, because standing only a few feet away, her back against a beam, her wrists still scraped raw from rope burns, was Mariah. She did not run. She did not hide. She watched. Her silence filled the barn like smoke. Brill knew instantly. Everyone did. There was no need for words. The truth was written in the blood on the boards, in the iron spike through the master's mouth, and in the set of Mariah's jaw. She had done this. She, the slave girl they thought broken, had turned the most feared man in the county into a trembling, blood-soaked spectacle. For a split second, something close to awe flickered across the overseer's face. Then fear took its place. "Bind her," he barked. "Now." No one moved. Mariah didn't flinch. Her gaze swept slowly across the crowd, lingering on the enslaved men and women who stared at her with wide, stunned eyes. Many of them had endured the same cruelty she had. Many carried scars that matched her own. And in her silence, in her courage, they saw something they had forgotten they could feel. Possibility. But Brill was not a man to hesitate. He lunged forward and grabbed her arm, yanking her away from the post. She stumbled but didn't resist. She simply kept her chin lifted and her eyes locked on the master's. Her silence pierced him deeper than the spike. Brill dragged her out into the yard, shouting orders for chains. He meant to tie her, cage her, whip her, break her spirit into dust. But as he pulled her forward, a murmur rippled through the crowd, soft at first, then louder. "Elijah," whispered one voice. "Don't let her die," whispered another. Mariah heard every sound, every breath. Voices she had never heard speak aloud now murmured her name as if it carried power. Brill shoved her into the dirt. Dust clung to her clothes, her skin, the drying blood on her hands. Her chest rose and fell with exhaustion, but her eyes, dark, steady, unbroken, held a spark the overseer could not extinguish. "Fetch the iron," he snarled. "Master or no master, she answers for this." A hush fell, because just then, an old woman stepped forward, Mama Osa, the midwife who had delivered half the enslaved children on the plantation. Her spine was bent, her hair white as cotton, but her voice carried with the sharp clarity of prophecy. "She ain't the one who needs answerin'," Mama Osa said. Brill whipped around. "What did you say?" The old woman lifted her chin. "You heard me. Look at him." Everyone turned. Master McAllister, pinned by his own cruelty, was choking on his blood. His fingers clawed weakly at the spike. His eyes rolled. Whatever words he tried to force out became nothing but gargles. The same suffering he had forced upon Mariah now silenced him completely. But Mama Osa wasn't done. "That girl survived what he done," she said. "He took her voice. She took his evil. That's balance. That's the Lord's truth." A murmur of agreement spread, not loud, not defiant, but enough to make Brill's hands tremble. He glared at Mariah as though she were something unnatural. "This ain't balance," he spat. "This is murder." Mama Osa's eyes narrowed. "Who say he dead yet?" At that moment, the master released a strangled, wet-grown proof that he was still alive, although barely. Brill's face flushed beet red. "You old witch." But before he could finish, the plantation bell rang out from the big house 6 long, frantic tolls. The signal for emergency, for death, for chaos. All heads turned toward the hill, and Brill froze. Because someone was running down the porch steps, Miss Clara, the master's eldest daughter, pale as linen and screaming. "Bring him to the house, now." But Mariah saw something the others didn't. Behind Clara, standing in the doorway, was Mrs. McAllister. And she wasn't screaming. She was smiling, a small, sharp, knowing smile, as if she had been waiting for this moment, as if Mariah had unknowingly set in motion a secret the mistress had been keeping for years. By the time dusk bled across the McAllister plantation, every enslaved man and woman had already heard the story, whispers passing like sparks from one mouth to another. They spoke of Mariah's escape, the blood on the barn door, and the way the master's screams had echoed across the fields like a curse unraveling. But what none of them yet knew, what not a single soul could fully imagine, was what Mariah intended next. The plantation had changed in just a matter of hours. Overseers tightened their grips on their whips. Torches burned longer into the night. Doors were bolted. Guns were cleaned. Every white face carried the same expression, fear, thinly masked behind rage. Inside the slave quarters, however, an entirely different feeling pulsed. The fear that had defined their lives wavered, just slightly. Hope, small, trembling, unfamiliar, moved through them like a sigh. Mariah sat at the edge of the cot in Ruth's cabin, her hands wrapped in strips of cloth. Her body was battered, her lips split, her shoulder bruised, and her tongue gone. But her eyes, Ruth had never seen them look this sharp. There was something new behind them, something decisive, heavy, unshakable. Ruth placed a trembling hand on her friend's cheek. "You done something they ain't never gonna forget," she whispered. "But child, they comin' for you. You know they comin'." Mariah did not move. She simply stared ahead, her jaw tight. She had known Ruth her whole life, or rather, her whole life on this land. Ruth had been the one who comforted her when she was 10 and sold away from her mother. Ruth held her the first time McAllister tried to touch her. Ruth nursed her when fever nearly took her life at 14. Ruth had been the only constant, and now, Ruth looked more frightened than Mariah had ever seen. Outside, footsteps crunched too heavy, too many. Mariah straightened. Ruth's breath caught in her chest. The overseers. The door slammed open. 3 men, rifles slung across their shoulders, stepped inside. Behind them, the moon cast a pale, icy glow across the floor. "Where is she?" barked Hodge, the head overseer, his voice thick with fury. "Master wants her found. Now." His face twitched with the fear he wouldn't admit aloud. The whole plantation had heard McAllister's strangled cries. They had seen the blood. They had seen the nails. They had stepped into the barn and watched the strongest, most brutal man they knew collapse into a shaking heap. Mariah stood slowly. Ruth grabbed her wrist, shaking her head, pleading silently. But Mariah stepped forward anyway. Hodge raised his rifle, but his hands trembled not from exhaustion, but from something deeper. Dread. "Don't take another step, girl," he warned. Mariah took another. Hodge cocked the gun, but Mariah didn't freeze. She simply lifted her chin and stared at him with the same defiance she had given McAllister the night he cut out her tongue. Hodge faltered. Her silence, her total, unbroken silence, threw him off. He had expected a scream, a plea, a sign of weakness. Instead, Mariah gave him nothing. Her expression was carved from iron. Ruth suddenly stepped between them, shaking, hands raised. "Please, please don't hurt her. She ain't done nothing." Hodge struck Ruth across the face with the butt of his rifle. She hit the floor with a gasp. Mariah's breath froze, not in fear, but in something deeper, something that ignited behind her eyes. Hodge grabbed Mariah's arm harshly. "You're coming with us. Master don't care what you did, he'll handle it his own way." But Mariah planted her feet. She twisted her wrist hard, wrenching herself free. The suddenness of the movement threw him off balance. Before he could recover, she slammed her forehead into his nose. Bone cracked. Blood spurted. Hodge howled. The other two overseers lunged forward, but Mariah was already running straight out of the cabin, across the yard, into the darkness. "Get her!" Hodge screamed, clutching his face. "She ain't leaving this plantation." Mariah sprinted, bare feet pounding the ground, lungs burning. Behind her, she heard the dogs being released. Torches flared to life. Men shouted orders. The plantation had become a hunting ground, but Mariah moved with a purpose none of them could match. She knew the land, the hollows beneath the cypress trees, the sloping banks of the creek, the thick brush where the dogs lost the scent. She had spent her entire life laboring under the weight of this land. Now she used it to disappear. She slipped through a break in the fence, sliding into the swamp's shadows. The mud swallowed her footsteps, the reeds swallowed the sound, and the darkness swallowed her completely. By the time the hounds reached the fence, sniffing wildly, snapping at the air, the trail had vanished. Hodge screamed orders, but he already knew the truth. Mariah hadn't escaped by luck. She had planned this. This wasn't desperation. This was strategy. Somewhere in the swamp, hidden from sight, Mariah crouched low in the cattails, watching the glow of torches through the trees. Her heartbeat slowed, her breathing steadied, and in the stillness, in the silence forced upon her by McAllister's knife, she made a new vow. She would not run, she would not hide, she would return. And when she did, the plantation would fall. Dusk settled over the plantation like a bruise spreading across the sky, slow, dark, inevitable. The cabins grew quiet. Even the crickets seemed to hush themselves, as if the air carried something they did not dare chirp against. There was talk, soft as breath, moving from cabin to cabin. Talk that the master had not been alone in the barn that night. Talk that someone else had seen what happened, someone who had no business being anywhere near that building. His name was Jonas, a half-blind slave boy, 12 years old, with eyes the color of storm water and a habit of appearing where no one expected him. Jonas saw everything. Or rather, he sensed everything. When sight failed, his hearing sharpened, and his memory grew roots. He had been in the loft of the barn, curled up among the hay to hide from the overseer, who liked to cuff him for walking crooked. Jonas had fallen asleep there, tucked into the rafters, like a forgotten thought, and he awoke to the sound of the master's voice, low, mocking, dripping with the kind of cruelty men used when they believed the world was empty of witnesses. Jonas didn't see the violence, but he heard it. He heard restraints pulled taut. He heard muffled cries. He heard the master's laugh, the kind of laugh that made the boy cover his ears until his fingertips stung. And then, something else. A sound sharp enough to freeze him. A gasp. A thud. Then the master's curse, breathless and shaken. After that came silence so complete it felt like a blanket smothering the barn. Jonas stayed still. He stayed quiet. He stayed hidden. Hours later, when the field hands discovered the master on the barn floor and screamed the plantation awake, Jonas slipped down the back ladder and vanished into the cane. But he returned now, walking toward the heroine's cabin with a trembling urgency that did not belong on a child's frame. Inside, she sat against the wall with her bandaged mouth, breathing shallowly, pain flickering behind her gaze. She had not spoken since that night, but she communicated in the slight movements of her hands, the tilt of her head, the burning fluency of her eyes. She lifted her chin when Jonas stepped inside, studying him the way one studies a creature that startles easily. Jonas swallowed, then whispered, I heard it all. The cabin seemed to shrink around those words. He wrung his hands. He ain't right. Master ain't right no more. And folks whisperin'. They say it was you, or a spirit, or a curse crawled out of the dark. She closed her eyes at that. Not from guilt. Jonas sensed that instinctively, but from something older. Weariness, maybe, or memory. Some say, Jonas continued, lowering his voice further, that whatever happened in that barn, it wasn't done by a person at all. This form to the compant. She opened her eyes again, and for the first time the boy stepped back. He saw something in her gaze that wasn't fear, wasn't anger, wasn't despair. It was resolve. Jonas took a shaky breath. I ain't tell nobody you were there, and I won't. But people talkin', ma'am. They say the master gon' lose his mind, trying to figure how his own tongue wound up like that. He couldn't finish the sentence. Even without describing the gore, the horror of the act hung over them both. She reached for a charcoal nub and a scrap of paper, one of the few ways left for her to communicate. Her hand trembled as she wrote, the strokes uneven but deliberate. Not me. Not a spirit. Not yet. Jonas stared at the message, baffled. Not yet? She wrote again. Evil done. Evil returns. He shivered, and she touched his wrist gently, steadying him, comforting him not with words, but with presence. Jonas had seen horrors, heard cruelties, survived punishments that would have broken most. Yet standing in front of her now, he felt for the first time a strange, quiet certainty. Whatever was happening on this plantation had only begun, and she, silent, wounded, and burning with some terrible purpose, was in the center of it. Jonas backed toward the doorway. I'll keep watch, he whispered. If the overseer starts sniffing around, I'll warn you. She nodded once, slow and solemn. He slipped outside. The night air swallowed him. Inside the cabin, she pressed her fingertips to her bandaged mouth, feeling the pulse there an echo of pain, an echo of memory, an echo of something stirring within her that had not stirred before. Something that did not need a tongue to speak. Something deeper, older, shaped by suffering, sharpened by injustice. Whatever had been taken from her, something else had awakened in its place, and the master, tongueless, trembling, ravaged by terror, was only the first to feel it. The night that followed was too quiet, so quiet that even the crickets refused to speak. Wind did not move through the pines, nor did the river murmur against its muddy banks. It was as though the world sensed what was coming, and out of respect or fear held still. Alara stood within the slave quarters, her back braced against the far wall, her breath steady though her heartbeat thundered like distant drums. The others could not hear her thoughts, but they felt the heat of her resolve. Since losing her tongue, she rarely made a sound, but her silence no longer felt like absence. It felt like pressure, like a storm building behind the ribs of every enslaved soul on the plantation. May, the oldest among them, watched Alara pack the few tools she needed into a cloth satchel, a shard of broken window glass, a thin coil of stripped copper wire, and a sliver of sharpened bone she had hidden since childhood. May's eyes widened. You gon' do something that can't be undone, she whispered, though she already knew the answer. Alara looked up. Her expression was calm, too calm. There was no hate in her eyes, only decision. She tightened the satchel, slung it over her shoulder, and walked toward the door. May's hand shot out, trembling, gripping Alara's wrist. Child, he took your tongue. Don't let him take your life too. Well, ass goes fine redded. Alara gently removed May's hand and shook her head. A life without a tongue was still a life, but a life under the man who had taken it? That was no life at all. The door creaked open. The night swallowed her whole. The path to the big house was lit only by a sliver of moonlight. Alara moved like a ghost between the shadows, bare feet, silent, body low, heart steady. Every step brought her closer to the man who believed he owned her, who believed slicing out her voice meant silencing her spirit. Fool. Inside the big house, Master Alden sat at his desk with a bottle of bourbon. The fire was low, but his eyes were sharp with irritation. He sensed something was wrong. Perhaps the silence unnerved him. Perhaps the memory of Alara's stare, the one she gave him as blood poured down her chest, had lodged itself too deeply in his mind. He took another drink, muttering, "Ungrateful creatures." Outside, Alara slipped through a side door May had long ago taught her to open. Her feet made no sound on the wooden floors. Her shadow stretched long across the hall as she approached the stairwell, stepping carefully to avoid the two creaking boards everyone knew to avoid. She stopped at the base of the stairs. There, leaning against the wall, was Alden's whip, the one he used for punishment when words were not enough cruelty for him. Alara kneeled slowly, took it in her hands, and studied the plaited leather. The grip was stained from the sweat of 1,000 beatings. Her fingers traced the handle, then paused. She lifted it, took it with her. The first act of reclamation. Alden didn't hear her enter the study. Or maybe he did and believed it to be a servant. Either way, he didn't turn around until the floor shifted beneath her weight. When he finally looked over his shoulder, the glass in his hand slipped and shattered on the floor. It was her. His eyes widened, not with guilt, but indignation. "You," he breathed. "I should have finished the job." Alara stepped closer. He pushed himself from the chair. "Don't test me, girl. You ain't got a tongue to beg with." But Alara wasn't begging. Her hand dropped into the satchel. Alden smirked as if she were foolish. "You think you—" He never finished the sentence. Alara drew the sharpened bone from her satchel and strode forward, quicker than he expected. Alden stumbled backward, knocking over his chair. He grabbed for his belt knife, but she kicked it across the floor, sending it spinning beneath the table. "You're mad," he hissed. "You filthy." She cracked the whip once, loud enough that the sound echoed through the halls like lightning. Alden froze. It was the first time he had heard his own weapon wielded by someone else. Sweat formed instantly on his brow. She advanced again. Alden reached instinctively for the fireplace poker, but Alara was faster. She lunged, slicing through the air with the whip. The leather snapped against his forearm, tearing skin. He screamed, the kind of scream that came from men who believed pain only belonged to others. "You witch!" he howled, stumbling back. Alara flicked the whip again, this time catching his cheek. Blood sprayed across the rug. Alden tried to bolt around her toward the door, but she blocked him, forced him into the corner of the room, trapping him the way he had trapped her. His anger warped into panic. "You can't, please," he stammered, slipping to his knees. "Please," he begged. For the first time in his life, he begged. Alara stepped close, lifted his chin, and stared directly into his eyes, the same eyes that had watched her bleed, the same eyes that had laughed when she fell. She opened her palm. The copper wire glinted in her hand. Alden's breath stopped. He shook his head violently. "No, don't do this." But Ilara's silence was her answer. She moved behind him, hands steady, wrapping the copper wire around his wrists. He fought, twisting like a cornered animal, but she held firm. She had spent years hauling sacks twice her weight. Alden's resistance was nothing. When his hands were bound, she forced him toward the door. He pleaded. He sobbed. He tried to promise her freedom, money, protection, things he had never given and never intended to. Alara dragged him outside, the whip at her hip, her heart cold. Tonight, she wasn't a slave. Tonight, she was the verdict. And Alden was the sentence. When the other slaves heard the barn doors slam open and the screaming begin, none dared move to interfere. They all knew this night belonged to her, and by dawn, justice would hang where his cruelty once lived. Rain had begun to fall in slow, deliberate drops, each one striking the cabin roof like a knuckle rapping on a coffin lid. In the dim glow of a single candle, the room seemed to breathe. Shadows expanded and contracted across the walls, curling around the corners like living things. Mira sat beside the hearth, legs drawn close, a wool blanket wrapped around her narrow shoulders. Her breath was steady, but her eyes were fixed on the doorway as if expecting someone or something to appear there at any moment. Mariah had not returned since slipping into the storm hours earlier to investigate the trail of noises they'd been hearing for days. No lantern, no boots, no sound of him anywhere. Only the storm, whispering against the walls. Jonas paced behind her, slow, restless, hands clasped behind his back. His nerves were stretched thin, but he kept his voice level when he spoke. "You saw something earlier," he murmured. "Before I came in from the fields." "You haven't said what?" Mira didn't look up. "It wasn't something," she said softly. "It was someone." Jonas stopped pacing. "Elia?" She shook her head. The candle flickered as a sharp gust rattled the shutters, and the room dimmed for a heartbeat long enough for Jonas to feel the hairs rise along the back of his neck. "Who?" he pressed. Mira swallowed. "A man, or what used to be a man, standing beyond the tree line, watching the cabin, his posture wrong, like he leaned on something that wasn't there." Jonas felt a cold coil wrap around his ribs. "And you think he followed Elia?" "I know he did." Silence settled between them, heavy and thick, pressing on their lungs. Mira's hands tightened on the blanket. "He didn't move when I saw him," she continued quietly. "Not even when the wind blew. He just stared. And then he was gone, vanished between one blink and the next." Jonas took a steadying breath. He wasn't a man easily shaken, but her words lodged beneath his skin like splinters. There had been talk on the plantation for weeks, quiet murmurs, half-coherent warnings whispered by the older workers, strange sightings, sudden disappearances, a presence in the woods that no one could explain. The kind of talk overseers dismissed and masters mocked, but none of them lived close enough to the woods to know better. Another gust of wind groaned through the window frame, and Mira pressed closer to the fire, as if heat might hold back whatever pressed against the night outside. "What if he isn't coming back?" she whispered. Jonas crouched beside her, placing a steady palm on her shoulder. "Elia's smart, strong. He knows these woods better than any man. He won't get caught off guard." Mira didn't look convinced. Jonas glanced at the door. The storm had thickened. Sheets of rain now battered the cabin like fists. The idea of stepping out there to search into darkness, into whatever Mira had seen, sent a tremor deep through his bones. But staying put felt worse. "We can't wait here doing nothing," he said. Mira looked up sharply. "We can't go out there either." Jonas rose. "If he's hurt, what if he's not the one who's hurt?" she breathed. The candle fluttered again, but this time it didn't go out. It stretched, flame narrowing into a thin, shivering spear of light like it, too, was listening. Jonas grabbed his coat from the peg. "I'm going," he said. Mira stood as well, gripping his arm. "You don't understand. That figure I saw, the way it looked at me, it wasn't angry, wasn't curious. It was waiting for someone to step into the dark." Jonas felt his breath stall. Mira's fingers tightened. "Jonas, something out there already knows we're afraid." For a long moment, neither of them moved. The storm kept hurling itself against the cabin. Thunder rolled low and distant, like an animal pacing in the dark. Then, from far off, muffled by rain but unmistakable, came a single sound. A knock, not on the door, on something hollow, wood on wood, a distant thud, then another, slow, measured, almost rhythmic. Jonas felt the blood drain from his face. Mira's voice dropped to a trembling whisper. "That's the same sound I heard earlier, right before the figure appeared." Jonas moved toward the lantern on the table, but before he could lift it, the knocking stopped. The sudden silence was worse, much worse. A heartbeat later, a new sound replaced its soft, slow footsteps coming up the cabin steps. The boards creaked under weight. Jonas grabbed the fire poker. Mira crushed the blanket in her fists. The footsteps stopped directly outside the door. The latch shifted, and the candle died. The morning after Silas Barrow's tongue was found nailed to the barn door, the plantation lived in a hush so deep it seemed the earth itself held its breath. No crows called, no horses snorted. Even the wind, usually tugging through the fields like restless fingers, stayed still. The slaves had gathered long before sunrise, drawn not by fear but by a force none of them could name. They stood scattered around the yard, in loose clusters, their faces cautious but alight with a flicker of something long dormant, something close to hope. At the center stood the barn, or what the barn had become. Blood had dried in thick, blackened strokes down the wood. Silas's tongue, pinned there the night before with a rusted spike, was gone. No one knew who removed it, or when. Some said an animal. Others said a slave brave enough to erase the last piece of him, but a few whispered something else, that she had come back for it. Lila, the girl without a tongue. The girl the master thought he had silenced forever. The girl whose shadow had been seen moving through the fields the night before, gliding where no footsteps sounded. Caleb stood among the crowd, his hands clenched into fists. He had not slept. Not after seeing her vanish into the fog with the grace of something unbound by bone or pain. He had followed the path she walked but found nothing, no footprints, no torn grass, not even the warmth of a presence. It was as though the land itself had swallowed her whole. The overseers paced the yard with muskets, but their bravado was gone. They flinched at every creak of wood, every flap of a loose shutter. Without Silas, they were men stripped of spine. They barked orders, but their voices quivered. Their hands shook as they gripped their guns. "Where is she?" one demanded. "Someone knows. Someone tell me." No one answered, because every slave knew one truth. Lila hadn't disappeared. She had returned to something deeper than the world she was born into. Around noon, the widow Barrow emerged from the house, wrapped in mourning black as though she were already attending her husband's funeral. Her face was white as chalk, her lips trembling as she scanned the yard. It was the first time she had stepped outside since discovering the grisly spectacle attached to the barn. "Which one of you did this?" she whispered, but not a soul replied. Caleb noticed something strange. She was barefoot, as if she had run outside without thinking, as if fear had pushed her out the door faster than reason. "It was her," the widow breathed. "I saw her last night outside my window, standing in the garden, watching me." The overseers stiffened. "She died," one muttered. "We all saw her thrown out into the swamps." "She's dead," another echoed, as if saying it aloud could make it true. But the widow shook her head, slow, trembling. "No, what I saw wasn't a ghost." Her voice cracked. "It was Lila, and she wanted me to know she wasn't finished." A murmur rippled through the slaves' fear mixed with awe. Suddenly, a scream tore across the yard. Everyone snapped toward the sound. One of the younger slaves, a boy no older than 12, pointed toward the magnolia tree. There, tied to the lowest branch, hung Silas Barrow's leather whip, twisted, knotted, and looped around itself as though strangled by invisible hands. And beneath it, carved into the tree bark in deep, clean strokes, were 3 words: "Still not done." A collective shudder passed through the yard. Someone began praying under their breath. Someone else whispered Lila's name, reverent as scripture. Caleb felt the meaning like a blade sliding between ribs. Lila hadn't nailed the master's tongue to the barn door as revenge. It wasn't even the end. It was a warning, a promise, the opening of something far larger than one man's cruelty. The widow staggered backward, pressing both hands to her mouth as if to keep from vomiting. Her eyes darted wildly from the whip to the barn to the fields, as though expecting Lila to step out of the shadows again. "She won't stop," the widow whispered. "Not until—" She didn't finish, because a heavy thud interrupted her. Every head turned. The overseer nearest the smokehouse dropped to his knees, clutching his throat. A second later he crumpled face first into the dirt. His musket fell beside him. His eyes rolled up white in his skull. Poison? Panic? Or something else entirely? Before anyone could move, another thud, another overseer fell. Then a third. Caleb stared. Breath stopped in his chest. No one touched them. No one went near them. They dropped as though pulled down by the hands of the unseen. The slaves backed away in fear, but also awe. The widow fled toward the house, screaming for the constable. Caleb didn't move, because in the corner of his eye, he saw something just for a second. A figure, small, light on its feet, moving between the cypress shadows at the edge of the field. Lila. She didn't turn. She didn't wave. She didn't speak, she couldn't. But Caleb felt her message all the same. Her silence had become the loudest voice the South would ever hear, and she was far, far from finished. The barn where Master Halcom's tongue had been found, nailed like a butcher's scrap, dried stiff as rawhide, eventually collapsed under its own rot. But long before the last timber surrendered to termites, long before weeds swallowed the path that once led to the whipping post, the land itself had begun to reshape memory into something sharper, more enduring than any witness testimony. Those who had lived through the night of Halcom's death did not speak of it aloud. Superstition ran thicker than blood in the county. Some said the woman without a tongue haunted the rafters, her silence louder than thunder. Others whispered that the nails driven through the master's tongue were not hammered by human hands, but willed into place by something ancient and violated. Whatever the story, no one tried to own the plantation after the incident. Families arrived, walked its boundaries, and left before sundown. No one stayed. All they knew was this: the enslaved woman called Mariah had vanished into the marsh the same night Halcom died. She did not limp, though her wounds should have crippled her. She did not hide, though mobs had searched for any sign of her footprints. She simply disappeared, as though the world had parted for her. The slaves who remained did not fear her disappearance. They honored it. Some said she escaped to join Maroons deep in the swamps. Others believed she walked straight into the afterworld, refusing to remain a captive even to the earth. But one thing was agreed upon: she had not fled. She had ascended. For weeks, locals claimed to hear whispering along the wind at dusk, soft, broken sounds like a voice straining to form words without a tongue. Mothers locked their doors. Children refused to fetch water after dark. And every now and then, someone would swear they saw a woman standing at the tree line under the moonlight, her face half-shadowed, her eyes alert but unreadable. The sheriff once tried to investigate. He lasted 3 hours on Halcom land. At noon, he was brave. By dusk, he rode away pale as linen, swearing he heard nails being driven into wood though the fields were empty. Years passed. The Civil War arrived, then died. Freedom came, uneven and jagged. The plantation house decayed. Vines wrapped the porch columns like choking hands. Rain eroded the steps. Animals nested in the parlor where Halcom once drank whiskey and declared himself a god. Only one thing did not rot: the barn door. It remained upright long after the barn itself had fallen. Locals avoided it, even the drunk, even the foolish. Weather never warped it. Rain never washed the stain away. The nail holes remained clean and visible, as though something heated from within had preserved the wood. Some claimed the wood whispered if you stood close enough. Others claimed the whispers weren't coming from the wood at all. By 1872, the county decided to burn the remaining structures. A crew arrived, carrying torches and kerosene, confident in their task. They burned the main house first, then the sheds, then the overseer's quarters. Every structure succumbed quickly, collapsing into ash and hissing embers. Only the barn door refused to catch flame. The men doused it again, and again. The fire swelled against it, crackled, clung, then died as though smothered by unseen hands. The foreman cursed and ordered it pulled down by chain. 4 mules strained themselves into exhaustion. The door did not budge. One mule collapsed from the effort. Another broke its own harness trying to flee. By sunset, the men fled too. Word spread. Some called it cursed. Others called it justice. One night, decades later, a freed descendant of the Halcom slaves arrived alone on the property. Her hair was silver, her back bent, but her gait was steady. She walked straight to the door and laid her palm upon the wood without fear. The whispers ceased. The wind stalled. The woods held their breath. After a long moment, she murmured, "Rest now, we remember." And the door, the cursed, unmoving, impossible door, fell backward onto the ground with a sound like a final exhale. When the woman left, she did not look back. By morning, the door had disintegrated into soft, weightless dust. Some say the dust spread into the soil and fed the trees that now rise tall and unbroken over the old plantation grounds. Some say Mariah walks among those trees each dusk, a silent guardian, a symbol of the voice stolen from her and the justice she delivered without words. But the people who remember her best know the truth. Her story did not fade with the plantation. It grew, it rooted, and it will whisper through the land for as long as injustice dares to breathe in the dark.